Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, we'll delve into Character 4's build collection updates, as we'll go through all of their builds and kind of build showcase them very briefly, as we'll go through 16 builds that are on their loadout slots in the build collection, going from 4.01 to 4.16. The last character of main account, as I have 4 characters on my main account, and then the 5th character as 5.01 until 5.16 is basically on a separate second account, where we have basically they're not attached together. And then here as well, Character 4 is kind of the place where a bunch of somewhat weirder builds end up. Of course, they have all of the general builds that I would need, as we'll kind of see in a minute. But they have also a bunch of somewhat weirder stuff. Usually they are kind of more my test bed, and then, or well, they have usually a few spots available at the very least. And if I like the build, I might move it around or trade it around if I feel it fits better, maybe on a different character. As always, with these build collection updates and build showcases in general, we'll have everything timestamped so you can jump around to a specific build if that is what interests you. And as well, as we did with the last few of these, I'm not just going to talk about what changed, which used to be kind of the format of these, as every build did get some changes. If nothing else, a weapon changed or something like that. Every build has a new build picture, if nothing else, just for the UI, because of course the specialization weapon now has the modifier next to it. So I just wanted them all to look the same. And because of that as well, we'll go just through every build, and first I'll kind of discuss what has changed or what may have been buffs or nerfs or such, or just maybe a rework of the build by itself without actually changes from this season. Afterwards, I'll kind of explain as well what the build is for, and then also how hard it is to kind of get together if you were one to copy it for yourself. I feel those two parts especially are very, very handy to kind of have in here. And that's also why we're just going basically through the entire collection one by one, and even the builds that haven't really got any major changes, we'll still discuss them, and I'll just give some brief info on them. As yeah, I know what all these builds are for, but that might not be clear if if you aren't you know, a little bit more advanced into the game, or actually me basically, but some of them are just silly as well. Yeah, let's go get started with 4.01. And on 4.01, we see a negotiator, in this case set up with a group of chests with Obliterate, a Cheska backpack with Vigilance, the other 4 pieces being negotiator. Negotiator did, of course, get a few changes to it, and they were all for, well, they got one big change to it, which was the backpack. And the backpack received a bonus going from increasing the spread damage from 2 other targets from 60 to 100 was the old value. The new value is from 60 to 112%. So we gain basically 12% more on the spread amounts. That does make it a lot more usable than it used to be, and it was already very usable. Situationally, you could definitely go with it. For a general build, though, I quite often enjoy having it in this setup, but then as well, I have a Negotiator ND recommended folder, where we basically have of the variants that we have in there with Obliterate and then Focus, both with and without the backpack. Situationally, you might lean one, situationally, you might lean another, and we'll see actually in a minute that I'm kind of set up to take advantage of both. And then, yeah, this one then, yeah, is set up here, for instance, as well. With a lot of the builds, we'll see them with Lexingtons. That, of course, is, yeah, the high-end AR go-to nowadays. If we take it now into the game, what we'll see, first of all, is that, yeah, loadout-wise, the loadouts as they are on the build collection, that's 4.01 as this, for instance. Yeah, this is literally loadout 1 on character 4. That is basically how that counting goes, and it goes, of course, all the way up to 4.16 on the build collection, and then, yeah, 4.16 is that, as we'll see in a little bit. What you might have already noticed there is that I'm saving it with 5 pieces of Negotiator. Now, of course, we wouldn't ever want to run it this way, but actually saving builds this way, as we've already shown with some of the other characters, I do this quite often, where we have 5 pieces or even maybe 6 pieces available, as we'll see in a second with Striker. In this case, the chest of Negotiator, the gear set chest is not very useful, so we're just leaving that one out. We don't want to have that opportunity at all. But yeah, the backpack, as we kind of talked about, if we're going to go more vigilance, we have better single target damage. If we're going Negotiator backpack, we have better spread damage, especially now the increase of that amount actually makes the spread damage much more viable as well and just much more effective. And it depends really on the situation, what I want to run. And that's why it's saved this way. So I could go, if I wanted the backpack, go with a Coyote, and then I have the backpack basically there as my piece. And then as well, actually, for instance, the Negotiator mask here is with the stats needed to kind of drop that. I could, for instance, as well, instead of the backpack, go, yeah, as we had the build picture with the Cheska, I could even put it in a memento, for instance, if I wanted to run it with a memento, maybe much more for solo. And of course, yeah, putting on or not, putting the backpack on or not, kind of really depends more on what I'm doing. So for instance, in more so legendary or something, if I wanted to run Negotiator, there, yeah, the backpack, there's a bunch of big targets. We can kind of get some spread going that way. If I were to, for instance, more so do solo bounties, I might go with the Vigilance backpack, where generally in the end, there'll be a name to left, basically, and we won't have that many targets to spread to, so having a little bit more single target damage there helps a little. And then, yeah, Negotiator is well worth having as a build. In the red styles, it is one of the harder hitting ones, and especially trying to get those marks going and such is, I find that's quite enjoyable. Playing something basically different than just shoot the enemy and you get more damage, Striker and Heartbreaker style. In this, you really have to get into that mindset of marking multiple enemies, shooting, picking what you shoot, picking what you mark, because there's definitely, you can improve your output and improve your results by actually really thinking about what you're doing. And I quite enjoy that with builds like Negotiator. And yeah, getting it together is pretty easy. It is all red pieces, of course, as we have it here. If you were to want to have a few blues, yeah, you would need to find a few blues or places where you can, have crit damage or crit chance, and then flip the core. Although you would generally want crit damage, as a gear set, of course, has crit chance, and you will kind of overflow in crit chance if you don't watch out. Yeah, it is pretty easy to get together with just whatever chest you kind of have. You can kind of mess around with it. Well worth having, and yeah, in a all-out form, it is very, very powerful. And moving on to 4.02, as with all my other characters on the build collection at the release, the 0.2 build is Strikers on them, and that is basically the go-to red build that I would kind of need to do some of the contents like incursions and stuff. So basically, each of my characters has one. Usually what they have is, it is shown in different variations. So for instance, character 1 is a chest AR, character 2 is an obliterate AR, character 3 is a chest SMG, and then on character 4 here, we have obliterate SMG, just to kind of show different variants and such. Here as well, showing it still with the Oreo, for instance, here, even though actually in a second we'll see, I'm not running that anymore, and this build picture might get an update because of that a little bit in the future, although Oreo is still okay to run. But then, yeah, here we have basically the Strikers with backpack, and then just in an obliterate setup for SMGs where we're going Grupo. The Striker backpack, of course, did get a change to it. It went from being for 100 stacks, being 100 and 1.0 multiplier, basically, or well, 2.0 multiplier. It is now, from that is a 1.9 multiplier. So it went from 100% increase to a 90% increase for the same 100 stacks. So we still have to stack just as much, but we gain less out of it. It's still, for me, the backpack is still overall the way to go, unless you're going for glass. If you want to go glass, going with the sacrifice and then the gift is definitely an option, but you can also go just sacrifice plus Coyote. With those changes, though, Striker didn't per se change much in its feel. It is definitely noticeable that we have a little bit less damage there, together with some of the weapons kind of course, being lowered, especially in the SMG category, and then as well the Ouroboros heavily by itself, of course. But as a tool, it is still, yeah, it is still a very important one to have. If we take it back into the game as well, we'll see actually it is nowadays saved with an attack vector, although I'm not sure if this attack vector is already optimized. It is actually. And then here, usually if I have a Coyote on the build, I'll usually have a replacement piece saved, as this is how the build is saved with this Cheska piece. But then as well, as we were kind of discussing earlier, having the other parts, because to me, it isn't a discussion about do I run Obliterate chest or Striker chest, or do I want a different backpack or not. I want to have all those options, basically, because situationally, I might go more with the chest striker. Situationally, I might want to definitely step away from it and go with Obliterate. I want to maybe try out different exotics in it, or for instance, having contractors for an LMG version. I have all 6 pieces, basically, on me at all time. These aren't actually saved in any other loadout as well, and they're just there as swapping pieces as I need them. Because if I want to go chest striker, then yeah, I have the pieces to kind of go that route. And then, for instance, yeah, we'll put in a Coyote here, and then usually on the glove slot is the place where I then have replacement pieces. Although actually, it turns out not on character 4, it's the holster, isn't it, on her? Yeah. So I have here, for instance, a Cheska and a Grupo holster that is just here to kind of swap in as needed. As yeah, for instance, this would be much more an incursion setup to go with this. Strikers, of course, is very easy to farm and a very important build to kind of have. That's also why each of my characters has one. It is their core red build kind of. The first 4 characters also have high-end build together with that. Even though that doesn't always get used much, still like having them around. But yeah, Strikers just being the go-to kind of red build. You kind of need it. And yeah, it's very easy to get together and yeah, core to basically any character of mine. Coming to 4.03, we have the standard Gen 1 glass high-end red perfect glass cannon version together here with the gift as well. This is one of the old standards. Still to this day works quite well. It is like the lightsaber. It is a bygone weapon of a more or from a more elegant age. Yeah, it is just Contractor's Fox gift sacrifice. Here we're just not. Just the holster is not named, otherwise everything would be named together with the Coyote. There, we're going to go with also then put a named weapon or a Scorpio there, for instance, and then everything would be named. This setup, of course, is very much a more upfront damage than, for instance, the Strikers or Heartbreakers or builds like that have kind of mechanics to them. This one basically has its damage all the way up front. It can lose a little bit of damage when Vigilance kind of gets lost, but overall still worth having because of its upfront damage for certain situations. What did change about this, of course, is that the 3 pieces of Providence, basically all 3 pieces kind of got hit. All of the 15 crit damages on brand bonuses went to 13. All of the 15 headshots went to 13 as well. So both of those are in here. And as well, the Cheska and the second piece Providence going from 10 crit chance to just 8 did actually hit it a little bit. Overall, though, versus high-end obliterates, having the obliterates kind of go down a little bit to 20%, I feel it's much more worthwhile if you're going high-end to kind of go the glass version anyway as well with it. Here's what I'm kind of showing. Yeah, a lot of the builds will show up with Lexington. I don't really have the Lexington on any of my characters. It is kind of in the stash because I only have 2 of them, of course. That doesn't mean that I just grab it when I need it, because if we go into the game, we see that it is actually build-wise saved in that way, but it is just saved here with the shield splinter. Not per se a weapon I would grab for this really anymore. The reason this used to be the go-to, this or just an F2000 was kind of the go-to for high-end reds, was that we wouldn't want 3 crit chance mods on the weapon, and that was really, of course, our only course of action if we for the mod slots kind of we went crit chance mods and then a magazine increase. Now, of course, the crit damage mods being 10 instead of 5 as they were, has made them much more viable. So we could actually, with the Lexington there, we have 1 crit damage mod and 2 crit chance mods landing on the same 52, but then of course, yeah, getting a little bit more crit damage out of it. The F2000 and such had compensation basically in its base damage that kind of made up for that. And this used to be then the go-to to kind of go with these kind of weapons that had 1 mod less, but had enough compensation on their base damage to kind of make it fit a little bit better, especially for that Coyote that we have, of course. And yeah, that is a decent change because, yeah, I would very much more if, well, Lexington, of course, but even if I'm going FAMAS, for instance, nowadays, going FAMAS and then putting a crit damage mod, putting 2 crit chance mods, 1 crit damage mod, and the magazine slot on it. That way, you kind of land on the same 52, and other weapons are also kind of usable with this. It is, of course, pretty easy build to get together overall. The names that we have in here aren't too hard to get. Well, Shield Splinters are from a specific source, of course. This is from doing the Hunters, the DC Hunter set. The gift is really the only item that is hard or would be considered hard to get here. It is a DZ named, but also not per se needed. This could be replaced with just the Providence backpack with Vigilance, or even a Cheska backpack with Vigilance. And then the holster would then need to be replaced with Grupo. We can replace these with other things, and yeah, this just goes from 4 seconds disable to 3 seconds for the perfect version. It does make a difference because we're basically doing 1 second earlier the DPS of the build that we would do with Vigilance. We're getting a whole extra second with it when it comes back, but it isn't too meaningful of a change. Well worth having as a build. I do like having this as a setup, as there are places where you want that upfront damage. For instance, some of the hunter fights and stuff. I find that actually it's much easier to do them if I'm choosing to do them with a red build, which quite often I'm usually going to just pick up PFE just for laziness. But if I wanted to do them with the red build, I would much more consider something like this, a glass red that has the damage up front instead of a strikers, which needs to kind of stack. And in that stacking time, against rogues, against hunters, they get time to kind of set up. Whereas if I'm taking this, for instance, against the Summit Summit Floor 100 Hunters, I'm likely going to kill one very quickly with a setup like this. I would just run in with a Scorpio, for instance, stun lock them and kind of just murder them. And then we go from a 2 versus 1 to a 1 versus 1. And even though my top end damage is less, overall, I'll do better. Yeah, let's move on to the next. And with 4.04, we come, of course, up to an error, 404, build not found. So yeah, on to the next one, right? Yeah, no, let's actually discuss this build briefly. Here we have the FI HalfHealer. We already saw a HalfHealer setup kind of on character 3, where we had one with high-end setup. This one is, of course, then with FI here, with 4 pieces of FI, a setup backpack, BTSU, a marksman rifle for opportunistic, a shotgun for opportunistic, in this case as well, SVD with InSync for our turret, and then Lefty for just doing sledge things, of course. Then here as well, important to kind of discuss the changes that did come in. Actually, the build itself did not change much. All of these are still kind of the same. The Lefty went from a 40% group buff to basically a 20% group buff. It is still a group buff, even though its text is incorrect, which we'll kind of touch on in the future with the wrong update to the wrong text. Because yeah, it does say nowadays just for the person who marked, but yeah, no, in testing it shows that it isn't. It is the entirety of the team. Basically anybody shooting at the enemy. It's a debuff on the enemy. We're putting that here as well with the Mosquito, because the Mosquito did get changed as well to have a group buff component to it as well. A 25% one. And that one's actually pretty useful together with this. What this build used to be is basically a support build for turret and drone builds. And yeah, it could run either a Healing Hive or an Artificer, helping either the skills kind of do more damage or helping the player stay alive. Here with its own turret, here the turret as well is backed up by 5 skill damages. So it does have a little bit of oomph to it, especially when we in-sync up as well here. And then applying, of course, opportunistic for the team, giving the FI buff, keeping everybody kind of topped off with the healing. It was kind of somewhat useful in the past, especially when turret drones ran a little bit more than nowadays, I feel. Because nowadays, back in the day, the turret drones were not too far behind high-end reds. Like it was okay running them. It was a little bit slower, but more comfortable. Nowadays, against things like the gear set reds, strikers, negotiators, heartbreakers, they don't match up well enough. So yeah, I haven't been running this that much. If we take it into the game, we see that it actually is, yeah, saved kind of in that same way. Although actually I am hiding that that there's an extra AR kind of saved here. I would never really run this AR for this build, but what I have this in here for is, well, before the Lexington existed, to kind of have a fall for a Heartbreaker TechTank, which is on this character, as we'll see later. But then, yeah, I would basically always run either a Scorpio or a Lefty, as we kind of had it on the build picture there as well. Putting this build together isn't that hard. You wouldn't even need this this red core here, for instance. This could just be all yellow and then foregoing, for instance, as well. The reason I have that red and it's a recorable place as well is that I can either go I can even go either go survivalist for a little bit more healing, or technician to also have artificer, as we kind of saw there. In the past, we used to actually run like 2 of these half healers together with 2 TurDro builds through just DUA and stuff. And DUA was basically with that like a 25 to max 30-minute ordeal, and very consistent. That was kind of the nice thing about that. Nowadays, of course, we pretty consistently just do it in like 15 minutes with 3 strikers and a foam eclipse. But yeah, back in the day, those didn't exist yet, not to that degree, not strikers as we have them now. So it was worthwhile back then, but yeah, I haven't been using this build that much anymore. 4.05. 05s on most of my characters, except character 1 actually, is usually Eclipse, as all of my characters do have an Eclipse setup, either in fire or in this case foam setup as we have it here. Although all of them are kind of set up as well to kind of be able to swap from, for instance, in this case, from foam to fire, and my fires as well to foams, just by having some of the pieces in my stash. Eclipse, of course, didn't change much at all. Again, just the Lefty changes, the Scorpio changes kind of did hit it a little bit. But overall, yeah, it is still what it was before. None of the tools as well that it kind of gear-wise uses got any real changes. Perpetuation did get actually a pretty big buff, and is actually much more usable than it, at least in my opinion. I just generally I like this combo quite a lot. We could put it on the pistol, but I also like having Future Perfect there. It is basically that we're too spoiled for choice, and yeah, we can go with several other things. And then yeah, on this character, it is specifically shown as with a foam eclipse. If we actually take this into the game, and we see there that it is actually saved as a foam eclipse as well, and kind of as the build picture, but in the same way as with strikers, or as we kind of were talking about. Having the ability to swap things around. I actually have at all times an Eclipse backpack on me that can slot into that backpack slot. I have a Val on this character as well that can slot in. If I now basically swap this foam to fire, that's my fire, and then I'll grab a Stinger Hive as well, just because, you know, set it up all the way. And yeah, now we're in Fire Eclipse. Although yeah, we are with this improvised glove with the skill haste here. This as well is actually, for the foam side of things, better than, of course, just putting a Hani U in there. We would only have 10%. Having a little bit more skill haste is kind of nice. So yeah, we do go with that improvise. We could, of course, also just go with Golden and then together with the Electric. Or actually on that, we have the other backpack that I totally remember the name of, the Courier, of course, with perfect creeping net. We could, of course, yeah, have this, for instance, also be Electric with normal creeping net. Although I would definitely recommend, as we already did, to go perfect creeping that. This increase in range and the cooldown being much faster actually makes that much more usable. But yeah, we could have an Electric piece there, but for Fire Eclipse, this is also still fine. It's good enough, close enough, basically, that I can swap to being a Fire Eclipse quickly, because I like having that option. And then, yeah, it is saved as a foam. But most of our characters are kind of set up as that, so that we can have the rolls. And I, of course, run Fire Eclipse quite a bit. Putting this build together is actually pretty easy in this case as well. For the Courier itself, if you're ever targeted Habsburg, you'll know that they'll drop quite a bit. You would need to find one to preferably recore here. You would want to have status effect and skill haste as well. Losing one of them is already a little bit of a loss. What you could go, though, is if you even have just the blue core and then one of the stats, you could actually go Technician with this. That works pretty well as well. Although having this Fire Grenade is kind of nice for especially the Lefty. And overall, yeah, a pretty easy build to put together. The go-to, in my opinion, for Legendary. This is generally one of us will be running this, 3 strikers alongside of it. That's basically how we do all of the legendaries we generally do. And then quite often what I would do is, for instance, swap in this BTSU for some of the harder fights together with a healing hive. And yeah, very much a core build to have. All of my characters have an Eclipse together with their strikers, and generally as well a PFE and a TechTank. That's kind of the builds that I need to have for a character for me to kind of be happy on them. And yeah, in this case, with a foam. As we move to 4.06, on this case, the high-end turret drone hybrid. A little bit of a mouthful and also a little bit of a handful sometimes to kind of run. As what we're doing here is kind of setting up to go with basically a pretty powerful high-end build with that capacitor, and then together with that having a turret and drone. I quite like these kind of builds. They used to be actually very useful, especially back in the day, as they could outcompete on certain missions against glass reds and stuff. They kind of, as we kind of discussed, kind of pale in comparison to strikers of nowadays and such. So I find myself running them less, but still very useful to just have around. I quite often just grab these for like some solo play. Build-wise, not much did change. Of course, what we did get is just reductions to a bunch of stuff, including the Picaros. The Picaros ends up being in this setup, still the better pick for us to go with, for 2 reasons, actually. One is that, yeah, it still does overall the better damage, especially if we get that skill tier and we get to recoup basically a core because of that, having the brand bonus be one of the skill tiers. And what it also allows us to do is to have the red cores stay on, for instance, the sacrifice. And in this case as well, for instance, if we want to have a coyote instead of our memento, for instance, having a much easier time getting that coyote in there, because we basically can have more pieces with red core, so we don't have to recore them. And then, for instance, in my case as well, I get to reuse some of these pieces in other builds. If we take it into the game, we see actually that it isn't saved as the build picture shows there. What it is saved with is 3 pieces of Providence instead in these higher spots. And the reason for that is kind of in the same way as some of the other builds were set up. This is actually set up to either take the coyote, as the build picture also kind of showed. If we go back in the corner here, I also have like a coyote with the gift setup there. And yeah, it is set up to either take the coyote in this slot, in the mask slot, becoming that way. And this is actually a setup that if I'm, for instance, jumping around a little bit and I'm not going to keep those memento stacks, going to safe houses and such, then I would much rather have the coyote, or for instance, if I were to grab this for fighting rogues, even though I generally wouldn't anymore, I have PFEs for that. But in the past, I would grab drone builds for rogues, as they work perfectly fine against rogues, not hunters, but rogues who do not hack them. And then, yeah, it's set up as well to go, of course, with the memento, because the memento is, of course, applying a lot of bonuses both to our weapon side and to our turret and drone. That's also where we go glass applying both to our turret and drone and to our weapon. That's kind of core to this as well. Getting this build together does require a little bit of farming sometimes, because yeah, we do want to have, for instance, to have this skill tier Fox's Prayer, the skill tier on this Brazos. The Picaros isn't too hard to get because yeah, we just need this to have the crit damage or crit chance that we need, and then we can record it. But this other Brazos piece generally also will require a bunch of resources to kind of get going. We have a memento in there, which is kind of sometimes harder farm. Capacitor, of course, is very easy to get on the other side, especially when starting out. You just do 5 summit challenges, and then yeah, especially this. As we'll see in a minute as well with the other build that is kind of the counterpart to this. This 2-piece Brazos, even though on damage it is basically equivalent to keeping Chuska plus Fenris, if I remember correct, which we did the calculations on. It is basically just a tiny bit more damage. But then what it also allows us to have is one more red core on one of these pieces, making one of these pieces much easier to get. So that's one of the reasons to kind of also consider that, putting it this way. And we also see more of that with 4.07. These 2 builds kind of live side by side in the build collection. This is the CombatMedic, the high-end CombatMedic, again as well with glass, and that's also to reuse pieces between the two builds on this character. Because yeah, we can either go to drone setup and we're kind of reusing the sacrifice, the Picaros, and the same Fox's Prayer kind of in between the two. Change-wise, of course, yeah, the capacitor became a little bit better than it used to be, just a tiny bit, basically. Just the base weapon became better. Its talents and stuff stayed the same. PKRs took a little bit of a hit, but still here as well, it is basically the go-to piece, especially because it lets us also get pretty easily a Fox Repair in here. And then here we see actually the benefit as well from this Brazos pieces, because while they're a little bit harder to get, and gain us just a tiny bit of damage, not too much anymore, because in the past with Picaros being 15, it was the clear choice. Here, yeah, you could consider going, for instance, Cheska plus Fenris, but then what we have is that these two pieces allow us to have a red sacrifice and a red gift. So a full red gift and a full red sacrifice, keeping those cores there red. That is actually, of course, a very big benefit. First of all, because they're easier to farm, of course, but also I get to reuse these pieces in other builds as well. If we take it into the game, we see that this one is actually fully saved like that, because I'm always going to run the BTSU. The BTSU is kind of core to this build. We don't have any skill haste from other sources, so we're kind of going to go this route. This is, of course, getting this build together is kind of hard. We are recording a bunch of pieces, although, yeah, we're keeping a red sacrifice and gift. This gift could also, of course, be replaced with just a Providence or Cheska piece in this setup with Vigilance, just normal Vigilance. BDSU, not that hard to get, just farmable, of course. And nowadays, there being 3 gloves, it is a little bit harder than it used to be from targeted. Capacitor, of course, again, very easy to get from the summit challenges. Overall, not too hard to get and well worth having. This has become, again, most of the combat medics this season being no regen has really made it very useful again, especially in seasons with no regen, especially nowadays the way that no regen works with the out of combat regen being disabled fully as should be, but also us no longer being able to just weapon swap to bypass it. And then together with that, of course, we also now have that regen from regen stat, so basically from memento or some such, doesn't apply anymore. What I run this as is basically in group settings, I'll run this to basically bypass the no regen for our group. I still keep a bunch of my damage. I don't give up as much damage as for instance, going just a full healer would be. Together with that, I also get to just shoot, which I kind of enjoy. We do, of course, yeah, not give that group buff and such, so it is very much a trade-off, and much more so than, for instance, as well, going a red FI, this can heal so much more than that can. Of course, as well, with the BTSU, we can also do the overcharge and the supercharge and stuff like that. Well worth having, especially if you're kind of into those kind of builds. I've recommended this to certain people very, very confidently. It isn't for everyone, but yeah, especially if you're kind of in that, like, I want to be able to support and still kind of be competently firing and you know, murdering on my own as well. This is very much a build to kind of get for that. As we come to 4.08, the high-end Headhunter, specifically kind of set up for pistols, as we have it here with the DNH piece. Not much changed for this build. The Regulus did get hit a little bit. You'll feel that. Everybody that kind of runs these kind of builds has felt that, as the reload especially went kind of up quite a bit. Although, of course, this build does have a ton of weapon handling to kind of offset that with. Weapon-wise as well, we kind of stuck with the M870 because, yeah, on this we would go generally with a shotgun and then either a rifle or a marksman rifle. Definitely worth considering as well in this slot is an 1886 nowadays. But yeah, I'm just sticking a White Death into here because, yeah, sometimes you want to just hit a little bit harder. And stat-wise, a few of these, of course, did get a little reduction. So the one-piece Providence went from 15 to 13. The nothing else actually brand bonus-wise got hit here. But overall, this is then a build that I generally want to have one on each of my characters as kind of a Headhunter build. And this is then for farming really great, of course. This can deal with 5 directives, basically any directives, well, even 10 directives in Summit, completely, because, yeah, we're not ammo dependent, we're not per se in any way dependent on anything except just shooting the enemy and trying to just get the chain killer, or, well, Headhunter to kind of go with this chain killer, and then just kind of make explosion happens with the Regulus. And then if we take this into the game, yeah, it is kind of saved in that exact same way, of course. I do, of course, as well, always have a harvest. Basically, all my characters as well have a harvest with determined, because that's, of course, the other great big tool you can kind of use here. That is, yeah, sometimes you can slot that in if you're more looking for that kind of determined kind of farming gameplay. Trying to get this build together, it isn't that hard. Most of the pieces are LZ named, light zone named. The only piece is the gift that is kind of harder to get out of the gear parts here, because of course as well, the Dodge City Gunslinger holster you can get from the quest that you get from Anaya basically, and just following a guide for it, you'll get it basically within a little bit of playtime. Then of course Regulus is still the one true remaining raid exclusive, because it never got added to the DZ, because it comes from a project from Iron Horse, of course. So it remains solely a raid exclusive, where of course the other ones got added to the DZ loot pool as well. So yeah, but getting the Regulus can be pretty consistent, and you just need to find a good group, and you basically need 2 clears, 3 clears. Well, technically 3 clears, but you can do it actually doing it on 2 characters on the first week, getting the resources, so that on the second week you can get your Regulus if you were want to get it quickly. Getting this build together outside of that gift and the Regulus is yeah, kind of those 2 are kind of the harder pieces, but you can of course go with yeah, just a determined pistol, harvest, or 586/686. This gift as well could be replaced with just whatever high-end with just normal vigilance, in this case likely Providence with just normal vigilance. One setup wise that we can also do as well, actually, that I kind of enjoy having, although I'm not kind of set up for here, is actually I have the pieces now as well to go with a memento, and of course then what we need to do is get the Dodge City Gunslinger holster out of there. But if we go memento, then actually the piece to kind of go in here is a claws out with headshot as its stat. And yeah, that setup is actually, I've been enjoying kind of both setups. This, of course, yeah, is one of the classics to kind of have. Well worth having alongside of the Headhunter's Fury setup with Hunter's Fury with Headhunter. This is the counterpart to it in the high-end settings. This, of course, doesn't have the disorient and the armor on kill that the Hunter's Fury version has, but it has much more weapon handling, so you feel that the changes to the Regulus are much less felt, basically, because yeah, we have a bunch more weapon handlings going on in here. And this as well is then set up for very easily having the Dodge City in there. The Dodge City is basically always in there, making for, yeah, very hard opener if you need that, and yeah, quite often you will. And we'll continue on with a 4.09, the Heartbreaker, or as it's kind of named here, the RedBreaker. As yeah, we're going full red with this, a full red setup with it. We're keeping the chest. We're leaving out the Heartbreaker backpack. We're going with a Vigilant Cheska here. Here as well with M4, although Lexington overall is a better pick. But yeah, I'm kind of keeping on some of the build pictures, I'm putting the Lexington to the side, assuming that everybody knows how much more powerful it is than most other high ends. But of course, a lot of people will not be able to get it until we kind of find out how, if they're going to repeat the event. Maybe it was truly a one-time thing. We'll see. And then yeah, this is just the classic Heartbreaker, 4 pieces Heartbreaker, or for in a red setup basically, which has become much more viable because of the changes to it. As yeah, the stacks basically went from a 1% per stack to a 1.1% per stack. Basically, what they nerfed off of the Striker backpack, they put onto the Heartbreaker's chest. It was scheduled in PTS 1 to be a 1.3, which was a little bit insanely high. They ended up with a 1.1, which has definitely buffed it, and actually a Heartbreaker in this setup with a Coyote and a Vigilance backpack actually is kind of the counterpart to the Obliterate in a damage sense, a competitor to the Obliterate Strikers. The downside, especially of course with Heartbreaker, is it doesn't stack as well, as we'll kind of discuss at the end here. But yeah, the big change was especially that, yeah, it does get much more per stack, 10% more per stack, basically, out of it. If we take it into the game, we'll see actually the repeating pattern, as we kind of discussed a little bit with some of the other things, is that it is saved with 5 pieces, and that has been done again as well. So I can either go Coyote Or I could, for instance, as well, putting in an LMG here with a fitting talent, either flatline or killer. I could go, for instance, with having then contractors instead. Or if I were to want to try this out with other tools like the holster, which is actually really good. I'll also say here that that's the reason as well why it's not on the build collection at all. The holster, I don't use it at all yet, and that's because to me it is basically broken. Its reload doesn't seem like it should be there. It's not in the text. It seems unintended. Together as well with the ability to put both bonuses on one weapon, that also seems completely unintended because the text like explicitly says that should not be the option. But yeah, we can't do those things. So until it is basically fixed, I'm not putting it on the build collection, but it's of course very usable. Like there is no reason for you to not use it. My you know, my sensibilities that do not have to like really impact your choices. But yeah, it's kind of set up in this way. It is actually, of course, much harder to get together than Red Striker. That is one of the strikes against it. One of the strikers against it is that we have to recore all of these if we want this in a full red variant. Although, of course, if you were to want two blues or something, that is, of course, much easier to, or just as hard, basically, with the striker. We would need 2 pieces to recore here to red. With strikers, we would need 2 pieces to recore to blue. So it is definitely usable. And the biggest downside of it, even though I have it and I kind of like using it, especially in the TechTank version, as we'll see in a minute, is the stacking ability of Heartbreaker. It is, if you do them side by side with a striker, you'll notice how much poorer the Heartbreaker stacks. And that is all down to basically striker counts every hit correctly and fully. Heartbreaker doesn't seem to count every hit on the enemy, even if they're pulsed in the correct way, in the correct conditions. It doesn't seem to count every hit, and it seems very inconsistent. It seems likely server-based because of that. Is my kind of you know, speculation around that. But yeah, it is very much noticeable, and because of that as well, it has not become generally a used build, but well worth kind of messing around with. And coming to 4.10, we have here a triple tick build, as it's affectionately called. This is an OD setup made to make 3 ticks happen. We'll go into those in a little bit. Changes-wise, to start with, of course, the Pestilence kind of came back into this build, very much usable now as a main weapon, the Pestilence. In the past, actually, I was altering or going with an Iron Lung in that slot, more so just getting a little bit of that fire out, but the Iron Lung just also did damage. The Pestilence shot, basically, the debuff was nice, but yeah, the main weapon was just so horrendous in the past. Now, of course, it has become much better. Sadist got a big buff, and of course, what happened to OD is that the chest became much more usable than it was. Its buff went from basically with the chest to 1 point or it would become a 1.35 in the past. Now with the chest, it becomes a 1.5, but that's of course just to the hits. And that's also why we're going without the chest here, because I've seen many of these triple tick builds getting altered to have the chest in here. To me, the weapon hits of this is not the important part. They are pretty low as we have them here. We have some weapon damage, in this case even a little bit of crit crit damage behind it, although barely, of course. But yeah, we basically have 5 red cores to kind of apply there, which isn't even the full 6, of course. Instead of that, the glass applies both to the bleed, all 3 to the bleed, and to the vial ticks, and of course to the pestilence ticks as well. None of those would actually be benefiting from the weapon hits hitting for more with the OD chest. So in this case, yeah, we're definitely sticking with this perfect glass chest here. If we kind of take it into the game, we'll see that it actually is exactly as it is saved or shown in there. It's is how it is saved, and that is because there isn't much variation into this build. Yeah, you could go, for instance, as we were kind of talking with Iron Lung. But yeah, I'm gonna kind of stick with going this route instead. And then what this build is for is very much that it can actually deal well with ammo directives, even solo. It is actually pretty potent, and when you have the debuff actually on enemies, basically 1 shot on a red will mean that red will be dead in a few seconds because they will have the triple ticks on them. The bleed, that will trigger the Val as well, of course. And then, yeah, the Val tick is kind of going, and then as well, some pestilence ticks as they go around. Yeah, the status effects are in here as they apply to both the bleed and the Val, but of course not to the pestilence. Very important. That's just the weapon damage. That's what those 5 red cores are for. The status effect is to that. It is kind of a build that we're kind of speccing into a few parts that all come together to kind of do basically dot damage over time damage. And this is just the more dots build. This is just more dots, more dots, more dots. Not enough dots, more dots. And that's what it kind of does. Of note as well, I want to kind of just briefly highlight here, this is the one build as well where I'm, even though we're kind of going a little bit towards crit chance, crit damage here with the mods and such, I actually have the Pestilence here spec'd to, or the third stat is damage to armor. Because in this one case, the damage to armor also applies to our bleed, to our Vial, and to the Pestilence itself. The crit chance would, of course, only apply to the hits. And that's also the reason why this character basically has 2 Pestilences, one for other general uses, but then for this specific build, then we're going with the DTA on this. So we're breaking convention, going DTA there, and as well going with the perfect glass chest. Getting this build together is not that hard. These are red cord pieces, of course, for here. So we're kind of coming with that. We're just putting the stats underneath it. OD can't be crafted ever. There's no blueprints for them. This and True Patriot are kind of like open world gear sets where you gotta go and farm them. But of course, with targeted nowadays, that's pretty easy. The Sacrifice and the Val and the Pestilence would be really the only harder pieces to get here, being exotics. And yeah, the Sacrifice here as well. We could go actually with different stats. These are very much up to choice. Here me going crit chance, crit damages. These could also, for instance, be more so, yeah, other things, protection from elite. Some people go with. I prefer this overall. And going into 411, it isn't as silly as 511. But it is a little bit silly. It is a Red Eclipse. This is very much a setup that is kind of made for one thing in the past, which actually doesn't exist anymore, but they still keep it around. We'll discuss that in a minute in its purpose. Changes-wise, Eclipse didn't, of course, see any real changes. Obliterate went down a little bit on this build, as Obliterate just in general went from 25 to 20. Elmo did get a little bit of a hit in its weapon mods, but actually its base went up. So overall, it landed up around the same amounts. And yeah, really didn't change much, honestly. Lefty changes, of course, to Sledge do apply here as well. And yeah, to get this build together is very much a hassle. If we take it actually into the game, we'll see that it is actually saved in that way as well, as we're not really going for variations on here, because yeah, we could, for instance, try to get a Red Eclipse holster as well, and then we could go with maybe other exotics. But honestly, this is the setup to go with. And the thing that this is set up to do with its red cord Eclipse pieces, which are very hard to get and annoying, because yeah, this comes with yellow cores. Most of the pieces will drop with yellow minor attributes, so getting crit damages and crit chances may take quite a while, although you can craft for them as well, of course. So then just the Cheska chest, which isn't that hard. Elmo and the other assorted weapons here, not that hard either. Neither is Shocker Punch as an exotic. And then what this build is for, or used to be for, was the old Hollywood, where you needed, where Shock actually was a decent way to deal with the shielded enemies. Back then as well, Shock would only remove the shielding, because jamming and Shock would only remove the shielding. Explosions would make the explosions happen on the enemies. And of course, back then as well, the explosions were actually very minor. They didn't actually kill everything the way that modern Hollywood, as yet, it basically gets changed and it got buffed. But yeah, back then this could just run up to an enemy with the shield equipped. The Shocker Punch has a if using all 3 items, all the bonuses up above, and then also, and the shock from the melee attack will have a 5-meter radius starting from the first target. But yeah, you basically get this shock on melee, and the shock on melee is also if you don't have the shield up, so you can just run up to an enemy, smack him, shoot them, and then here as well we have the Eclipse backpack to kind of give us a 30% buff to status affected enemies, because we're gonna status affect them that way. That would spread the shock around, remove all the shields from the enemies, and then we could shoot them. It was kind of a creative way to kind of deal with old Hollywood. Old Hollywood doesn't exist anymore, but the smacks from this, of course, now make the explosion also happen. Although we have so many easy ways of making that happen that I don't end up running this that much. Although this does have the Eclipse backpack and we could put glass on here, of course, or perfect glass, having a really high explosion for Hollywood happen because that scales off of those. But this is just a silly setup to sometimes kind of run around with and kind of do silly things with because, yeah, we do have basically the Eclipse spread, although, you know, our status effects aren't that strong or that long. But yeah, we're kind of making use of the backpack talent of Eclipse there as well. It is a creative way to kind of go for Eclipse. Not very usable and very hard to get together. But definitely, if you're going for a little bit of a silly thing, not the worst. And on 412, we see a Hunter's Fury setup for shotguns, specifically kind of... although we don't have any brand bonuses going that way, we are crit chance, crit damage wise kind of set up that way. Because of course, yeah, when we go for SMGs, we kind of don't go with any crit chances basically on the gear at all. And yeah, not much changed for Hunter's Fury, nothing at all, really. Setup-wise, gear-wise, this really did not get altered. We're still going Intimidate, Adrenaline Rush. Weapons-wise, we did see a little bit of changes. The Scorpio is definitely no longer really a main weapon for damaging. So while it is very useful still, it is still the weapon that can do what it can do, and especially on Eclipses or on FI or something, it is definitely the main pick still. Here, where we're trying to do damage outright, not so much anymore. But then we see, on the other hand, the weapon that got buffed quite a bit, the Tsunami, especially the SASG base weapon kind of got buffed. And together with that, the Tsunami is then now really the top pick here. And this build with the new Tsunami really does really well. And yeah, we could go, for instance, as well with some alternates here. This build, if we take it into the game, is set up in that same way. Although actually, yeah, instead of the Scorpio, I have it actually saved with two main weapons here as well. An SASG with Killer being really good and powerful, of course. Damage component-wise, much more than Pummel would be, but then Pummel, of course, has also a built-in reload. And that built-in reload is really what pushes it up there. But situationally, I could see myself going either way, or even grabbing maybe Brazen here. That's also why this is free talentable. And yeah, we have also, of course, other setup ways of just, yeah, putting, for instance, a Mento in here, going that route. And then, of course, I have a Scorpio at the ready to go from other builds if we need that. Generally, I will pick one of these two and then put the Scorpio there. Getting this build together isn't that hard. This is all red cord pieces, although you may notice that actually I have actually, for these three pieces, for instance, I've actually record the core instead of the minor. And that is to, if I were to want to, I could go with up to 3 blue cores here, because I have 3 places where I could put that in. Kind of removing my ability to change the third or the minor stat here, of course, but that's still kind of fine. Still going Cheska Grupo overall, those give pretty good bonuses, especially here where we're kind of pairing them with going full red. Of course, the more blue we go, Badger Tough might be a decent pick here, but I'm kind of keeping my options also open to, for instance, sneak in an SMG if we wanted that here. We could go still, we're pretty close where we can flip a mod here, put a full crit damage SMG in here, and we would be pretty close enough to be able to use that effectively as well. As a setup, this is well worth having. A Hunter's Fury setup is definitely something that I quite enjoy. Much more run and gunny than for instance, Strikers. We get that, especially the armor on kill feels pretty good. Together with that, having the disorient, kind of saving your life quite often. You will notice that you'll murder one of the enemies in front of you and the rest of them will get disoriented. That's more than enough time to kind of act upon and just, you know, make sure that you can either get to safety if there's too many of them, or just murder them outright if they're pretty weak. And yeah, overall, well worth trying out if you haven't. A shotgun version as well nowadays with the Tsunami, really powerful, and yeah, works out really well. And on 413, we have a setup that I don't end up using much myself anymore, but very common setup to see in the DZ. Overall, this is one of the general picks for AR setups, as we have it here with Fenris. 4 in the DZ, where we go with Adrenaline Rush, Intimidate, That's also where this one kind of still stems from. I have one on character 1 and one on character 4 here. One on character 1, it is with SMG, here with an AR, which are DZ builds, basically. I don't DZ much anymore, but for a long time, this used to be kind of the meta towards the end of me DZ as well. Still back then, this was the meta to go to. And still nowadays, even though there is other metas alongside of it, for instance, Umbra sneaking in and such, this is still, yeah, very usable out there. I don't find myself in the DZ much nowadays, but I also, yeah, I'm still like, I don't want to kick these builds. Of note that we want to discuss here as well is while no changes, really big changes happened here. The Cheska, of course, became a little bit less with 8%. The Grupo went from 15 to 13%. The Catharsis as well actually got a pretty big buff to it, where it is no longer an 1% per stack for 30, it is 1.5%. So it's actually getting 15 weapon damage more. And that is actually a pretty big buff to the Catharsis, although in this setup, this already lived with the Catharsis. And yeah, in this kind of setup, Optimist actually is still a decent pick when we have like this many blue cores. Although in this case, Lexington would actually outdo the Shield Splinter here with even at these lower things. Although with grade 25, I don't actually, but they are pretty close to each other. So yeah, Shield Splinter is much easier, of course, to get overall for that. But as well, the Eel Bearer kind of became a better weapon than it used to be, much usable there. But of course, yeah, Pesty and stuff are kind of the mainstays there now, as together with, I've seen Bighorn used quite a bit. A build that is overall worth having sometimes, but I just don't end up personally using it much, just by virtue of what I play. Trying to get this build together is actually pretty hard. Of course, we're blue coring a lot of stuff, including here a chest and a backpack. So a Cheska chest with Unbreakable. This would be an easier to get Super Unicorn. We do make that distinction that if the core is something different than the miners, because here this would been a red core, of course, with a chance crit damage, that does drop more often than, for instance, with the Habsburg Super Unicorns, where we have a blue core and then we want 2 red miners. That means that that will drop a lot less. This is less of a unicorn than that, but not by much. These aren't easy pieces to get overall, making it pretty hard to get. But of course, what most people do is either go full red version until you have that blue core, or just yeah, go with other choices where you give up the brand bonus, for instance, to have a blue core already and then put crit chance, crit damage, and Unbreakable on it. And yeah, none of these pieces are per se easy to get, but that's also always the thing with DZ builds. Recoring to blue, usually, especially as we have it here with the red core pieces, just will cost you quite a bit. And we come to 4.14, and often linked in my chat on Twitch build, as it is the Heartbreaker TechTank. This is, of course, the TechTank style that I kind of helped popularize. Definitely not of my origin. I sometimes, cringe at people going like, "Oh, yeah, he's the guy that like invented." Like, you can't invent builds. You can at best kind of help popularize them. And I've definitely tried my best as well with these. And what changed, especially for this build, is that we went, of course, now we get a little bit more bonus than we used to. We're keeping the layout the same, but we're basically getting a 10% additive more out of the chest talent. Basically, it goes, instead of being 100% separate multiplier, it is 110% separate multiplier, or well, a 2.1 separate multiplier. And because of that, we gained a little bit there. Lexington also came in, and definitely if you have the Lexington, that is the main pick for this one. Here we're still also showing it with the Kingbreaker. That is, if you don't have the Lexington, I would go either an M4, a Fall, or the Kingbreaker. The Kingbreaker definitely also still performs well. It is close to the damage of the rest, but it sustains so much better in the burst DPS. It is close to basically the M4 and the Fall. Pretty far behind the Lexington. That's the reason we go with Lexington first. And then, yeah, the sustain versus the M4 and Fall especially is much better, and it is kind of still even in sustain a little bit higher than the Lexington. So yeah, that's weapon-wise we kind of stayed with our weapons, actually, as that is also how I was used to use it. If we take this into the game, it is actually, of course, saved exactly as is shown there. It is kind of a rigid setup. We're kind of going with a Cheska piece and a memento, and then 4 pieces of Heartbreaker, 3 of them, 3 of them with blue cores, 1 of them record. That also makes this a little bit easier than the Striker TechTank to get together. And then, yeah, what this build is for is, this is my go-to, this and the Striker TechTank is my go-to for solo play. If I'm playing solo, not much can compete with these. They are very hardy, and they can have a 6-tier shield being healed by a 2-tier Artificer. Once the Memento is charged up as well, that will apply the skill efficiency to those, meaning that this shield is kind of around the 6 million-ish mark. This Hive is healing for around 40%-ish. And yeah, that makes for a really strong shield facing towards enemy. The rest of the build is kind of set up for the damage end of it. And here we're going with, yeah, Heartbreaker or Strikers, basically, and then just extracting that bonus out of here, together with landing actually, well, here we're 52-105. Not the greatest crit chance, crit damage numbers, but still respectable. And getting this build together is decently easy. That's also why, yeah, even 2 newer players kind of recommend it. Even though they have to, the Memento is kind of core to it, so you kind of need that. Also, you do need to go unlock Technician if you don't have the ultimate pack where it's automatically unlocked for you. But otherwise, you kind of do need Technician for this. That is kind of core to the TechTank. It is half of the name, literally. So, but yeah, a build well worth having, and one of my go-to solo builds. Especially, for instance, one of the things I noticed going into a lot of legacy missions through the year, or climax missions, which are now legacy climax missions, of course, through the years. I never really had much trouble with them, but that's more like I would run these kind of builds solo into them. I wouldn't go in first time with the red build unless I knew already, like unless I was just trying to go fast. But usually with builds like this, I'm much more consistent. While they're not as fast as red builds, I can basically, overall, I'll clear out the mission in one go, and that will frustrate me less than going a lot faster, but maybe having a failure here or there. And here on 4.15, we see this character's PFE. As I kind of alluded to, generally I have on every character a Striker, basically. We have the Striker, we have an Eclipse, we have a TechTank, and then we have a PFE. PFE is very useful, of course, for dealing with rogue fights and stuff like that, but also sometimes just for getting some of that certain things done. And as well, Countdown, especially during extraction, is very potent. And this one used to actually be, because I could, of course, I do have a preferred one when it comes to the PFEs. That's definitely the Cheska plus Grupo, and then either Catharsis Coyote, and then 3-piece Improvise, together with the Scorpio. That kind of setup I very much prefer to most of the others, with Intimidate, Adrenaline Rush as well. But I don't want duplicates in the build collection. At least I try to avoid them as much. And that's kind of the genesis of what this build before this kind of used to be. And that it was a combination of hazard protection, although not full hazard protection, like 60%-ish, together with crit damage. Because with SMGs, of course, we didn't really need to spec too much into crit chance, because they came basically with 36 crit chance on them, of course. And that's also one of the big changes that can happen. The mods on weapons, now we can actually go with crit damage mods. Although on attack vector, as we have it here, we can't put 30 crit damage on it with mods, with 3 crit damage mods. We can only put 2 crit damage mods, and then still got to keep 1 crit chance mod, because the underbarrel needs to be a long underbarrel rail to be a crit damage mod. So here we have 2 crit damage mods for 20 crit damage and 5 crit chance as mods. And that actually brings down our average a little bit. So one of the things was in the past that the reason I was going with other stats was that we would put crit damage on every piece. Basically, with the Cheska Grupo, you would reach close enough to 60. I don't remember what the old number was, but I think it was like 58 or something. And that was close enough to just basically forego putting crit chance on any other of the parts. We could, of course, put a crit chance in, get rid of Cheska, but actually, I was trying to like do other things. Here, though, we're kind of going a different route. Now we've actually pulled in as well a chill out onto this to pull in the Fox's Prayer. Really, the chill out, if you're going to go with the chill out for PFE, it needs to either be that you're going for 3-piece regen, which is actually the build I have kind of on character 1, or you have to pull in Fox's Prayer. Basically, trying to put this in to pull in a Grupo piece or any other piece really is not going to be worth it, because you do basically give up the brand bonus that this has, because the 5% bonus armor bonus is really not that worthwhile in comparison to a lot of the brand bonuses we could get there. But the Fox's Prayer kind of makes up for that with the detox. And then here, yeah, we have kind of all in with crit chances and such. And well, we have basically 4 of them on the gear, and then with the weapon, we're kind of landing on this perfect 60. Actually, it's a exactly 60, which is kind of nice as well, of course, and then a decent crit damage to go with it. One of the big changes as well was that, of course, Sadist got a big buff. That made Ridgeway actually much more usable. The thing to kind of now consider is that this Ridgeway is here to trigger this 30% pretty consistently. While we're still not hitting for really high numbers here, we're doing that, of course, at 1200 RPM, but in a DPS sense as well, this build still isn't hitting that hard. But for a PFE, it is actually hitting decently hard, and that's because, yeah, we're making use of that Sadist. Then as well, the regen, of course, that we're getting off of this is pretty good for a PFE build that isn't losing armor really fast, because a little bit of regen when it's on a red build or something is not that felt, because, yeah, you just lose your armor pretty quickly here again. Here as well, we're using it holistically, kind of with Wicked to kind of trigger that as well. So as a build altogether, changing it to this setup, I've quite enjoyed it, and yeah, we're kind of making use of that chill out now as well. Now that it's also more available, I'm much more willing to kind of put it into the build collection, because we gain a tiny bit of that Fox's Prayer. If we now take it into the game, yeah, it is saved exactly as it is there. And yeah, Scorpio, of course, here on the secondary. One of the nice things as well, we can, in the past, of course, most of the SMG setups for PFE, because either I would go SMG or shotguns, PFEs are generally close range builds. Having now the ability here to not go with the Oreo, because even in the past, even with even with the old Sadist available, Oreo would beat most of the weapons with the old Sadist. Now here, we're going with Sadist, and then we can get a Scorpio, and that's actually one of the nice things about how maining basically high end. We get to have the Scorpio as our secondary. Trying to get this build together. PFEs are generally, especially high-end PFEs, but here actually we're just using 2 improvised pieces. But we're recoring a bunch of blue pieces here as well. I'm actually keeping, for instance, the backpack fully red. I generally want 3 or 4 blue cores, so this is kind of meeting that. I wouldn't actually want more than that. If I had even the ability, I would likely still not choose to go Wicked, like have a backpack with Wicked so we could record it. I likely just keep this. Because, yeah, 4 blue cores is more than enough, and then we have a little bit of survivability. This is, of course, yeah, annoyingly hard to get together with the improvised pieces. This will cost you quite a bit of resources generally. You have to craft them. The crafting generally, yeah, it's sometimes like this one, we get a max stat, which is quite rare, but likely with this as well, the armor was then like almost empty, still costing a lot. But yeah, because of that, it does require a bunch of resources. And then, of course, we need a blue cord, or well, we could go with a full red, but yeah, here we're going with a blue cord, a Fox's Prayer, although yeah, we could give that blue core up for red. The chill out as well is just generally just keep the armor core. You don't really need any other stats there. If you're gonna red this, any brand bonus is gonna beat that total armor. Don't use this as a red piece. Just please don't. And yeah, what this is then used for is PFE protection from elites, if you're not aware. We're using here as well 13 PFEs. This is the other 13 PFEs that I have, the 6 being on character 3 and then 3 on this character. And that's will protect us from elites. This build is then 75% protected from elites, so it reduces any incoming damage by them by 75%. And that lets it do certain things, especially against rogues fights. It's really great during extraction in countdown. This can run into the middle of the pack of the enemies. I'll kind of shoot a bunch of them, all of them bleeding and such, especially if there's OD in the team and they make all of the people around me bleed as well. I'm kind of invincible. with this, and we can kind of just run interference, especially on heroic. That can be kind of handy, giving our allies time to just burn through the enemies, keeping their focus on us while our allies kind of finish off the enemies. And last, but on this character, actually not least, it isn't a testing build, as quite often ends up in those last few slots, as we kind of saw with character 2 and character 3. This one, though, is for use, actually. This is FI, but then in a blue core setup. So through the build collection, we kind of saw, FI in yellow cores, basically, of course, just being a healer or being a half healer. Then, of course, we saw red FI as well come by, going with the red cores on it. Here we're going with blue cores. This is kind of an experimentation going, putting all different cores on a bunch of different gear sets, as that's quite often a way to kind of mess around with it. Here as well, we're kind of using FI, the FI buff, of course, and then trying to get galvanize here to trigger, and trying to get blue armor, because if blue armor gets hit, you don't actually use your FI buff. It needs to be your white armor being hit or being reduced below its max to remove the FI buff. So galvanize is actually a good way, and quite often with a red FI running alongside of them with like a Vanguard galvanize kind of setup can actually work really well. But this is kind of built into itself, trying to build that up in itself. It kind of works pretty well. Changes wise, of course, if I didn't get any changes, neither did actually any of the gear at all. Scorpio became a lot less effective than it used to be, and this build kind of mains Scorpio, especially because that is actually the tool that we use to get the disorient or the shock to trigger galvanize with. So we're maining this to trigger this, and here we're as well going with Lavoisier, and Lavoisier actually is a pretty handy increase. That little bit extra that we get from it, if we kind of go into the game already, this little bit extra going to 30 meters around the enemy, that is actually huge, and especially for countdown and such is much used. One of the other things as well is actually there's a wrong text here, just to highlight that. This one actually says, as bonus armor to you and all allies within range. The normal one actually says only to all allies. This to you and all allies seems to imply that this will apply to you and the other one wouldn't, but both of them do. So this is actually going into wrong text, because it's kind of ambiguous and kind of weird that they didn't use the same wording for two talents, the perfect version, still working in the same way, because the normal galvanize also applies to you. But here we are kind of using it just for that range increase, because we could of course go with a better brand bonus than this, but actually that range increase is well worth it. And also, we get a little bit more bonus armor out of it. Here as well, actually, we have it as a 5-piece, as we had with a bunch of builds so far. And that is, of course, we had the build picture be with BTSU. We can go that route if we want to. But of course, if I want to mess around maybe in other ways, maybe if we don't have enough coyotes and we really should prefer that, maybe we can go that route. Here as well, actually, going Catharsis. I'm 6 blue cores now, basically, because that BTSU could never, of course, be blue core. So here I can have a lot more armor to share, and then, of course, I can take the hits a little bit. So kind of save that way to give us options, and that's, again, a pretty handy thing to do if you want to have those options. And I generally, as we saw on a bunch of builds, we do save them that way. And to round out this video, I hope you found it informative as we went through all of the builds on character 4 and all of the last builds of account number 1. We will go into account number 2, character 5 on the build collection, 5.01 till 5.16, which is a separate account. We'll see actually a bunch of repeats there, as that is very much the account where I basically have forced myself to have just one character. It's basically a single main character, and it's a smorgasbord of builds that I like, basically, as I keep on them the builds that I kind of enjoy from account 1 kind of over there, usually showing them on the build collection with a different variation, and we'll kind of see as well that it's a lot of 5-piece saves there. But that'll be for in the future, this character having a few of the more interesting builds. So I hope you maybe found some inspiration to mess around with something. As again, usually also come from these kinds of videos. I hope, as I've had that same thing with other people's videos where they kind of go into an entirety of what they're kind of messing around, not just showcasing the best builds, but also some of the like lesser builds that they still don't want to delete. For me, for instance, the Red Eclipse kind of fits that and such, or the old DZ builds that I basically don't use that much anymore. But yeah, if you did find this video informative or in some way enjoyable, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below. That does help out, so I'll do that a little bit of shilling here. For future videos, we'll follow this one up with the MMR in-depth, in-depth look into the headhunting tables for them. I was about to say DPS tables, but they're not. We're going to look at them in headhunting sense. Then, of course, yeah, we have character 5 to follow that up with. And then, actually, I'm kind of planning on going back into guide writing. And while we do that as well, I already have a guide that is completely done. And I kind of want to turn that one into videos, which is skills, as I did make a full guide, which basically turned out to almost be a manual for skills. So I want to turn that into likely several videos, as we'll go over the main guide and then kind of go skill by skill is kind of my current plans. So all of those in the future, but for now, we'll just round this one out, and I'll just say thank you for joining me. And as always, have a good night.